evening, everybody. I'm not a strider about the stage, not being a performer like Mick, so I'm going to stand here very, very safely, close to the microphone. And this is probably the most terrifying thing I've ever done. I mean, give me a lion in the jungle any day. But I'm going to start by saying I grew up hating to garden. And all this business about the RHS wanting to involve children in gardening, I mean, it's just a waste of time. I didn't understand what my parents were at. There were my parents, bottom up in the border, constantly, and their conversations as I hovered around the edge of them seemed to be constantly about disasters. There were always pigeons in the peas, the black spot on the roses, weevils in this, bugs in that. What was the point of it, I thought to myself. I did not understand. And being a country child, of course, my heart lay, my soul lay, I thought then, in the town with its great hissing Italian coffee machine. We were lucky to have some Italians, POWs, that never went back home, and opened the very first cafe that any of us as 15-year-olds in this Welsh border country where nothing ever happened, the first Italian coffee machine that anybody in the border country had laid eyes on. That's where one wanted to be, with these beautiful glass cups, not amongst the lupins. And my parents were very, very careful, superb gardeners. I look on them now and I say, if only I'd told you then. But this is one of the great tragedies of life. You never do tell your parents then, and you spend the rest of your life somehow apologizing for it. My father cultivated alpines with exquisite care and attention amongst magnificent stone troughs, the like of which you're never likely to be able to put your hand on again. And my mother made the most beautiful herbaceous borders that had ever been seen in our town. And actually, well, not a town, that was the problem. I didn't live in the town. But there it was. It just didn't have any point to me at all. I did try that route of, well, if you can't beat them, join them. And my brother and I both had gardens, although I can't quite remember whether they were given or whether we actually asked for them. I think probably the former. And my brother had a wonderful pear tree in his garden, and I had a Beauty of Bath apple in mine as the centerpiece. That had actually been planted by my mother long before I ever came on the scene, because it was her mother's favorite fruit. But nobody ever explained to me that unless my grandmother happened to be around in early August, the chance of showering her with beauty and bounty and all the other things was actually lost. And I've since learned that Beauty of Bath is what in catalogues you will see described as a shy cropper. It's one of those sort of phrases that gardeners get to understand about 15 years into their gardening lives. But as a child, this wretched tree, sometimes it had nothing at all, and there it was right in the middle of my plot. So the plot was actually a bit of a disaster. So that did not help me along my gardening route at all. But things changed ever so slightly when I got married, and my husband and I, our first home was a Thames sailing barge. It was a very 60s thing then, and we had this magnificent beast of a boat. We were actually both very keen sailors, but this was not the sort of boat you could sail. It was a monumental 80-foot thing, all built of oak and absolutely fantastic, great timbers, whole trees. Well, anyway, we acquired this boat and brought it up the river to Shepperton, where there was a woman who had what she called riparian rights. Do these things ever exist now? A wonderful sort of medieval phrase, riparian rights, which meant that we were allowed to lay our magnificent craft alongside her bank. And my mother had great hopes for me then. Here at last was a piece of land which we did not own, but we were at least adjacent to it. And so she arrived with basketfuls of primroses, snowdrops from the Llanwynedd Breast, where she had gathered them from a deserted cottage. And she brought a rose to go on the railings, and wild daffodils, all sorts of beautiful things, flag iris for the bank. So we spent the first couple of sort of hours of her visit getting rid of all that detritus that the Thames delivers wherever it is, the plastic, the rotting sort of bits of animal and old bedsteads and this and that. And we finally got a cleanish bit of bank and set the flag iris just so, planted the snowdrops and the primroses, laid the rose out along the railings of the paddock. But that first winter, of course, the Thames did what the Thames does and rushed down in a huge, great torrent, and all the flag irises floated down with all the other debris. And then that first spring, all the people came along the Shepperton towpath and thought, oh, how nice, primroses, daffodils, and picked them to take them home. And then finally the horse from the neighbouring paddock leant its head over and started chewing on the rose. So end of potential garden. And my mother said, hopefully, perhaps some pots on deck. But my husband, who's terrifically nautical, said no, definitely no pots on deck. And we weren't actually even allowed to have netting alongside the sort of deck sides to stop our daughter falling overboard. Instead, he actually put one of those old-fashioned leather harnesses on her and hitched her onto a piece of rope which was tied onto the mast. And the rope went just as far as the edge of the deck. He said, it'll encourage her spirit of adventure, he said, but the rope was just short enough to stop her actually going over the edge. So no pots on deck for all sorts of reasons which you'll now understand. So actually, the point of gardening didn't happen until we left the barge, rowed ourselves down the river, I was working at the BBC at the time on a programme called Late Night Lineup, and we had a party on board, and we rowed the last guests down the river at about 3 o'clock in the morning, and then went and put our very few possessions in the boat and rowed ourselves away from Falconet, and we've never seen her since. But it was a wonderful period of our lives, that. Even those times in our butty boat, which was a huge clinker-built boat in which we used to row our provisions up and down the river, even the time we had to row furnacite up the river to feed the Arga on board. And the boat, of course, with this heavy load, began to sink a bit too low in the water, and the furnacite started soaking up water as well. So by the time we'd actually reached the boat, we were practically rowing underneath the water itself. But even those things, of course, sweeten in the memory. But we did then go to a very pretty house and garden in West Sussex. And it was here, really, that I got the first essentials of gardening stitched into my mind and realized, of course, in fact, that you can't really understand gardening until there is some notion of permanence in what you're doing. You have to see the result of your labors. And that's why it doesn't happen, in those sort of times when you're drifting around and you're living in flats and, all the brilliantly exciting time that I remember in London in the 60s. But this house in West Sussex had a fairly decent sort of cottage garden. And there was a lot to learn from that cottage garden. And also a tremendous lot to learn from our magnificent neighbour, who was a woman called Jo Schwarby, one of those extraordinarily strong, splendid sort of spinsters, as it were, left after the First World War. And when I first started prowling around that garden, looking at the borders, trying to work out what was in it, suddenly this window would be thrown open in this next-door cottage, and this voice would shout, "Don't touch that border!" And I'd look up and say, oh, I thought we owned this. I thought this was our garden. Not a bit of it. Jo Schwarby had seen that we were complete green necks as far as gardening was concerned, and knew that there were treasures there that actually I would go and ruin with my gardening fork if I stuck it in. And she was absolutely right. But it did make gardening, as you may well imagine, a slightly nerve-wracking business. Whenever I ventured out and started looking at the summer jasmine, the window would go open again. "Don't touch that jasmine, you'll have no flowers if you prune it now." And then she would stomp around and she would tell me precisely when I had to prune the jasmine. So it saved me from all sorts of errors, and it did stitch those lessons quite firmly into my mind. But she became a tremendous ally. And she used to hide Easter eggs in birds' nests for the children to find. And when she finally asked us to water her bonsai when she went away for a very rare weekend break, I felt somehow we'd passed a sort of test. But it was in that garden, I suppose, that I first started to think about what I wanted to get from gardening. And from the beginning, actually, growing fruit and vegetables was a very important part of what I wanted to do in a garden. And there was a little patch of a field over the far edge of a wall. And it had a dual sort of delight for me, because when the children sort of got more than usually appalling. You know, those moments when you feel that the only solution is to actually give them away to the first person who passes down the lane. I used to run as fast as I could down the house, from the house, down over the lawn, jump over the wall into this patch, and it would be at least a minute and a half before one of the children caught up with me, and that was a very precious minute and a half, I can tell you. And all mothers shacked up for the first time with their small children will understand what I mean. But also, actually, although it was pretty uncompromising clay, that patch, in it I grew the best sprouts I've ever grown in my life, and therefore stitched in another lesson that sprouts like what they call firm ground. And you can certainly call this clay of West Sussex firm ground. Oh boy, firm and a half. So I did learn a great deal of lessons there. But I also learned another lesson. My parents had seen what was going on, that I was getting interested in this garden, so they sent me their absolute Bible as a Christmas present, Hillier's Manual of Trees and Shrubs, an absolute classic, paper-covered version they had, and that's the one they sent me. And their version had always been marked up with all these rhododendrons and azaleas that they'd been planting. So I also sort of started ordering rhododendrons and azaleas, of course, without realizing that here in West Sussex, I was in a completely different territory. And I only, I think, killed about 4 of them before the penny finally dawned that a hot clay garden is not the place to be growing rhododendrons and azaleas. But then finally, we actually made this move to West Dorset, to a house which, when we took it on, Queen Anne Rectory now sounds, you know, sort of rather desirable prospect, but it had no roof, and there was no room with a sort of complete floor or ceiling in it. And my hat goes off to the health visitor who called quite soon after our arrival there, found me feeding another baby. So often babies seem to go with moves. And I was crouched in what had once been the scullery, a great fire going in the grate, but no ceiling, and ivy growing up the insides of the walls. And to her tremendous credit, she said nothing, nor did the health visitor who had actually caught me when we were still on the barge, crawling on hands and knees up the gangplank with the first baby strapped to my stomach because the gangplank was too icy for me to be able to risk getting aboard on any other way. Again, no comment. So, tops to health visitors. But this Queen Anne Rectory, it took us 18 months to actually bash our way around the boundaries and find out where our garden actually lay. And when we'd begun doing that, we found that there was actually a rather tremendous kitchen garden involved in what we had bought. We couldn't see any of this because it was all completely overgrown with sycamores and all sorts of other rubbish. And so that was my first sort of direction, to get this kitchen garden back into full working order. I also was a slightly sort of child of the 70s in that way, in that all sorts of things then began disappearing, if you remember. Bread and oil went on the first of its tremendous price hikes. And I did sort of feel a slight drive towards self-sufficiency, not the complete weave your own shoes sort, but, you know, just something where you could grow food, have firewood, chickens, that sort of thing. And actually, after about 15 years hard labor, that kitchen garden did look sort of almost as I'd hoped it might have done when the house was first made, divided into its 9 noughts and crosses, sort of 17th century squares, and I'd made all the way around the wall a sort of enfilades of espaliered pears and peaches and nectarines and plums, and it sort of had that air I hoped if anybody had walked in, not that I had imposed anything upon it, but somehow that we had released what was lying there. It was a fantastically strong house. It ruled our lives for nearly 40 years. It held us, it protected us, it horrified us, it involved us. It was a wonderful place. Was that a ting on a glass? 1 minute. And it was not an easy place to leave. But I knew that we would have to leave it. It was not a place in which we were going to be able to lead an old age. It was too big, too problematical, too devouring in a way. And so we made plans for the move, and it was inevitably the right thing to do, absolutely the right thing to do. But on that last day of the move, I did wobble badly. The border outside the study was at its jungly best, silhouetted against the sun with the royal ferns just uncurling with that amazing zen backflip that they do. And I thanked the garden for all that I'd learned from it. We toasted the past, we toasted the future. I laid my cheek against that moss of the courtyard wall. I said goodbye to the pears that I'd spent so long training. And then we walked away, leaving that garden blazing in the May sunshine. Thank you.